All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. I have a guest with me who I've been following for over a year now. His name's Tim Nowak. He is. I don't hope this doesn't sound too arrogant, Tim, but I kind of refer to you as the Joe Turner of the EMS fire services side of the coin, because we've been following each other now, I think, over a year on LinkedIn, and you have a lot of content that is similar to mine in the sense that I target the city manager space, but you are a player in the EMS fire space. And I'm really eager to have you on the podcast today to talk to city managers and other public sector executives, and I even have a growing audience of elected officials who follow the program, about the impending crisis in EMS and fire services that you believe is coming to bear on the American society. And I'm eager to have you on here to talk about that and your experience. You're a practitioner, you're a consultant now. Please introduce yourself to the audience, Tim.
Oh, thanks, Joe. I appreciate that, and rightfully so. I kind of see you as the same respect to me of you're probably the city manager equivalent of what I do online on LinkedIn especially. So no, it's great to be here. Great to chat with you, and I think it'll be a pretty fruitful and just good conversation overall. So I'll take a step back, and I'm Tim Nowak. So I've been involved in the fire and EMS industry for a bit over 20 years now. I actually started my career in Wisconsin, jumped to in Green Bay, Wisconsin, started to transition over to the other side of the state and worked in Minnesota for a short bit before going to Colorado and living in Colorado Springs, but working in the Denver market within a hospital system, working with medical directors, the physicians, the hospitals, a number of EMS agencies doing EMS training and some quality stuff, data management. Eventually transitioned to Florida and spent an unpleasant year there. Just the hot heat, humidity it is not my thing. So you making the move down there, I chuckle, but man, no way. So I did a year in Florida. I was assistant chief for a county-based EMS agency, pretty large population, about 440,000 or so. Not including the visitors that popped in, a system that ran about 50,000 or so EMS calls a year. So did that and was part of the organization there, and then eventually got into consulting full time. I'd always been in some sort of consulting role, mostly on the training side, but was able to transition to a full time position with Public Consulting Group, which works with a lot of EMS agencies, especially throughout the country, doing cost reporting and working with Medicare ground ambulance data collection, working with state Medicaid programs, and then doing the traditional consulting work, which is feasibility studies, operational analysis, staffing plans, strategic planning, station studies, the whole thing. So anything related to fire and EMS studies that's really our wheelhouse and what we specialize in. So I've
Awesome.
been doing that for 2.5 years now, and really love that. It's a great spot. It's always difficult transitioning from chief to consultant, and I would imagine the same thing from city manager to consultant. It's very different. You have to wear a different hat, but like if your head can get into that game and think at that just different wavelength, it's very very rewarding. So I don't have one patch on my shoulder from one organization or one department anymore. I kind of consider myself as having a number of different snippets of a patch on
Right.
my shoulder, and working with agencies really throughout the country. So it's pretty fun stuff.
Awesome. One of the things I really like about your content, Tim, is that you are not afraid to have some strong opinions, some contradictory opinions, or go out against the grain. You have some interesting dialogue and some robust conversations in your comments section, which I applaud and I commend, because I try to aim for that myself. And you don't strike me as a guy who's trying to have a hot take just for the sake of having a hot take. I think you like to have some interesting discussions, but you also have some strong viewpoints, and I think that's what's helped increase your or help grow your audience and your platform on LinkedIn and so forth and so on. So I really love your authenticity, and I'm really excited to dive into this discussion.
Yeah,
Um,
I appreciate that. And LinkedIn's a fun spot. I've been on there for it's probably like 7 or so 8 years, and have grown up to just shy of about 19,000 connections, and by no means don't even know a fraction of them. probably even connected with some of the city managers and county administrators that are part of this podcast, and hope to join that and build up that number as well. But it's always fun, like getting to some conferences now. I bump into people that I've been knowing online for years, or chatting with back and forth. So it's nice to actually see them face to face, instead of that one little 1 inch picture or whatever on your phone. But LinkedIn's a good spot where especially in my industry, that so many people like to complain about stuff, and they
Yes.
have something to say, but they just need the floodgate to kind of open up a little bit. And I started out with LinkedIn just having questions. I was trying to get into the administration and chief oriented space myself. So what better way of plugging into and finding the people who were doing it and had great reputations as it was, getting connected with them, asking some questions, and trying to get their perspective on it. And from there, it grew. And I actually eventually published a magazine for about 2.5 years, that was specifically designed for EMS director professional development. And just the questions continued, and polls and
Yeah.
discussions from there. And yeah, I absolutely have an opinion, and I think a pretty strong one. Pretty much all of us within this administrative side are strong type A personalities. But on the same token, I am humble and cognizant enough to know that it's my opinion.
Right.
There are times where I can be wrong, but there are also times where other people are just wrong too. And
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
I don't want to, I'm not there to call them out, but at the same time, certainly am not afraid to express my opposition in a peaceful, civil manner, and
Right.
that's the
Right.
fun part.
Yeah, I think LinkedIn's definitely an underutilized and underappreciated platform, and I've really enjoyed my experience on it now for a little over a year.
Yeah.
But funny, before we jump into discussion, like we're going to talk about the impending crisis and sort of how we got here and how we get out of it as we move through this podcast episode. But one of the funny things I wanted to share with you is, me, I grew up in Southern California. And so in Southern California, there's no such thing, in my opinion, as a volunteer fire department. Everyone pays their taxes, and you call 911, and the fire and the police department, they show up. And so when I moved to Kansas and became a city administrator for the first time, it kind of blew me away that you had small towns that didn't have
Hmm.
24/7 police coverage, and they literally have volunteer fire departments, and where people literally sleep at home at night and they get a call on their phones, and then they got to rush to the fire station to go answer a call. I know you have some thoughts on volunteers and fire departments, and the like, but can you maybe sort of put a little finer point on volunteer firefighters and paramedics and EMS across the country, and how important and what's at stake here when we as we
Hmm.
move forward in this conversation?
Yeah, so the volunteer industry in general, and there are arguably there's more volunteers than there are career firefighters, EMTs, whatever providers throughout there. The hard thing is, though, is part of the numbers behind that are attempted to be tracked, at least I think, are getting to the point where they're almost anecdotal, and it comes down to what the definition of a volunteer is, and what many departments call volunteer. Really, especially from the city manager perspective or the administrative perspective, are no longer volunteers. They're actually employees. They're paid in some way or form. But at any rate, starting with this volunteer mentality of, they're in an unstaffed environment. Hopefully, at the very least, there's a schedule of 24 hours in a day. Someone is on the schedule, and someone has committed to basically being the sober adult that's going to respond and go to the call. That doesn't exist every place, especially the more rural you go, the likelihood of a schedule even existing is less and less. So there's no guarantee that someone will even show up, basically rolling the dice and hoping that today nothing happens. And sometimes, for some agencies that's been working for so long, they've been fortunate, but the time is running out. Volunteers have a great heart. Sometimes that can get the best of them because the heart might be there, but the physical ability or the compliance with regulation isn't there. But darn it, they're a good person, and they show up. So why don't we just
And
let's
and
give them a
and and,
break.
and isn't having someone there better than not having someone there, right?
You know
That's one of
it,
the things we wrestle with.
yeah, yeah, and it's to the point sometimes where no, like the answer is no. You're better off not having anyone there than having some of these people there, and not to target anyone directly. but that is sometimes the reality of the situation. There's argument within the industry too when it comes to training standards. So let's take EMT for example. To become an EMT, and every state's a little bit different, but for the most part, becoming an EMT is somewhere around 140 to 200 hours of training. So, what started as a 60-hour course in the 90s and 80s has transitioned to, upwards of 200 hours in some states. Some argue that, well, I'm just a volunteer. Why do I have to go through all this stuff? Well, because clinical care doesn't matter. Patient care doesn't matter if you're a volunteer or not. Chest pain is chest pain. Heart attack is heart attack. Nausea and vomiting is nausea and vomiting. It doesn't matter where you live and who you are, or any demographic, doesn't even matter at all. The standard of care needs to be there. And so you need to have this training. Even on the firefighter side, some states allow someone to be called a firefighter with as little as like 30 hours of training. And then, an extra 30 hours will get you to qualify to be interior qualified, where you can, put on a mask and go inside. But man, the amount of danger and risk associated with that for a hobby. Some career department or some volunteer departments treat this like it's a career, and they do a damn good job at it.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, they got some really passionate, dedicated
oh
individuals,
yeah,
and and like in my community, they would get something like $20 a run, right? So they
yeah,
would answer the call at 2 o'clock in the morning, come to the station, go fight a fire, or answer a car accident call or something like that, and they're getting $20 for the call.
hmm
I mean, they're not getting paid a lot. They're
no,
not getting paid what they're worth, and it's a very challenging environment. And as we lead to this conversation into a discussion about the impending crisis, where I think part of this is going to go is, at least in the feedback I've received from the volunteer firefighters in my departments that I've overseen as a city administrator in Kansas, is that you're just seeing a decline in the number of volunteers who are
hmm
willing to answer that call for a variety of reasons. Is that in a nutshell the issue, or is it more complex and convoluted than that?
I think that it's a very obvious symptom. I think that there are some root issues and causes to the collapse that really is actively happening, or in some agencies has already happened. They're just fortunate that the call volume is so low that they can just sneak under the radar without it having an impact, and luckily no one's been hurt or killed. So the collapse that's there, especially with declining volunteer numbers, it's I think we're all, getting to this point now where we're realizing that there is not going to be an improvement. There was always hope, and 90s was the beginning of some of this, but things got better. 9/11 happened, and things got better with regard to volunteerism and
Answering the
sparking
call of
passion.
duty, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but when that went away, I kind of joked and thought here, well, not joke, but like, thought that with COVID, if anything, COVID bringing people home, working from home, not having to be in their office, being able to be home, volunteer some time, answer a call with a pager, whatever. If fire and EMS agencies in the rural environments couldn't drastically improve their numbers because of people working from home, then the hope is gone. And that's really where we're at. And I think everyone is finally now admitting that the hope is gone. And while this is an anecdotal number, I can say, at least from one project I recently was involved in, took a look at every EMS agency in an entire state, and polled people, look at the numbers of how many volunteered or how many were involved. And for the most part, generally speaking, out of any agency that existed out there for the ambulance service, most of the agencies were really held up by 10% of the roster, or maybe even 20%.
It's that
Now,
classic 80/20 rule, right?
yeah,
80% of the work's being done by 20% or 10% of the volunteers, right?
yep. And the crappy thing is that if that roster consists of 12 people, that means that two or three people are running the entire roster.
Right.
And odds are, in some of those environments, that two of them are already married. So, one leaves, one retires, one dies, one whatever, and you're going to lose the other one. And now you lost 90% of your workforce by losing two people.
So you talk about collapse, right? That's a pretty strong word. Like,
Yeah.
what does this mean? What is this when you say there's a crisis, there's a collapse, there's an impending collapse, or can you put that sort of in a clear picture of what that means and how city managers and other public sector executives and elected officials who are listening to this podcast, what does that mean for them in plain English when you say there's a collapse coming?
Yeah, no, that's a good
And
question.
when?
Yep, and one thing I'll say is, our industry, my industry, is notoriously been good at this end of the world, what if kind of bullshit stuff. Seconds matter and seconds count, and if we can save one life, and what if we thrive on this mantra, and it's just scare tactics.
Is
It
it
really
almost crying
is.
wolf? Is it almost a
Yeah,
crying wolf deal? Okay. All
it
right.
is.
I can hear all the
And
elected officials who have unions in their cities saying
yep.
amen, amen. But
Yeah, and if seconds matter, if seconds whatever, then let's look at your response times and your shoot times, and then we'll talk about how seconds matter. Now, yes, there are times where seconds do matter. So okay, but we're talking about less than 1% of times. But in general, we're good about this whole blow up the scenario kind of thing. But I feel very confident in saying that we are facing collapse, and collapse means exactly that. It is not going to exist the way that it was. It's a massive crumble. It's not going to. You're going to call for help, and there is going to be no one, and it's coming. Is there a solid answer or time frame? No. I think that we are some agencies already have collapsed and already have failed.
I was just
Um,
gonna say, because you're saying their collapse is coming, but that means there has to be some that have already collapsed, right? Do you have any
yeah,
examples, or can you cite some examples of where this has already sort of happened?
yeah, and
Because that's a scary proposition, right? To think that 2 o'clock in the morning,
mhm,
my husband's having a heart attack, or my wife fell down the stairs or something, and no one's going to call
yeah.
to save my spouse, right?
Now, one thing I will say is, within EMS especially, we talk about, or we always say that if you've seen one EMS agency, then you've just seen one EMS agency. I think that's the biggest line of bullshit that we tell people. And I'm saying
Okay.
this as a consultant, where if you see one EMS agency, if you look at one of them, or fire department for that matter, you likely are seeing the remnants of 5,000 of them. There's roughly 22, 24,000 EMS agencies in the country. There's vastly more, probably close to 100,000 fire departments in the country. And so if you look at just one of them, no one is so special and so unique that no one else is like them. They all have the same problems. You name one department, and within 15 minutes, I'll find you 10 departments that are damn near exactly the same thing. So, whenever chiefs say, "Oh, if you've seen one EMS agency," no, it's bullshit. So their problems are not so special and unique to them that no one else has them. And with the collapse that's going on, there are different trends that are happening East Coast, and by East Coast, I'm referring more to New England
Okay.
versus the Southeast, versus Midwest versus West. And so
So there are
in
regional
West,
differences.
oh yeah, and West, I mean everyone but California, because California is different. There are some differences, and the crises, the collapse is hitting everyone a little bit differently right now, and I think a lot of that comes down to the mindset of volunteerism, which is vastly different in New England compared to anywhere else, and then the funding structures that exist too. So in New England, in like Pennsylvania right now is getting hard hit, and it's hitting the media, at least with this regard to agencies shutting down. Now, shutting down isn't necessarily a bad thing. Closing up their doors is not a bad thing.
Hold on,
Be-
Tim. What does that mean, though? I mean, if they're just shut down, who's answering the call? We mean it's not a bad thing. That
yeah,
sounds like
yep,
that sounds like doomsday to me.
yeah. So the issue is that in many respects, there are too many ambulance services and there are too many fire departments. Now, I say that to say that there are too many agencies, not people.
Got you.
So we take a state like Connecticut, for example. So Connecticut, breaking that down, Connecticut has 169 municipalities. There are 310 fire departments in Connecticut. So that means that there's, on average, what, roughly two.
Roughly two per each. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes that means that one, big city has their own department, and that means that a medium-sized community of 20,000 people has 5 fire departments. That means 5 organizations, 5 structures, 5 everything, likely with apparatus that they probably don't need. and just overkill because it's always been that way. We always had this side of the street, you got that side of the street. There's these little fiefdoms.
Right.
So
Is that
these,
particularly strong in the Northeast? The fiefdoms
oh,
is that dominant in the Northeast versus other parts of the country?
very, very much, very,
Okay.
very much. It certainly exists all over the country, but it's very prominent in the Northeast. And I would say probably from you could probably draw a line from Virginia and Northeast. Maine might be, semi-excluded from that, but Virginia certainly through, New Hampshire, Vermont, that's very common.
Okay.
Once you hit North Carolina, there's a stark difference, at least how EMS is operated, all the way down south and then certainly westward. But yeah, the Northeast right now is getting hit because there are just too many agencies. There don't need to be that many agencies.
Okay.
They need the people. And half the problem is that out of 5 fire departments serving one small township, let's say each department has a roster of 20 people. So you would think by math, 5 times 20 is 100.
Right.
Likely though, it's only 65 people because one guy is working for 2 departments, volunteering for 2 departments.
Ah, got you.
This
Okay.
girl is working for 3 departments. So it sounds like there's this abundance, but there's not because there's so much, crossing over, which means at the same time then that one person on these 2 different departments, which are primarily volunteer, sometimes they're private nonprofits, so 501c3s, or they might be municipally owned or operated. But now this person needs 5 types of insurance, from the organizational standpoint.
Right.
5 insurances, 5 workers' compensations, 5 sets of turnout gear. It's $2,500 a pop. Radios, pagers, 5 of this, 5 of that. So there's this multiplication of resources, and it's not just duplication. There's triplication,
Right.
quadruplication,
Right.
and it's just unnecessary. When if some of these places would just come together, them shutting their doors is not bad
Got you. I'm
because
tracking you now.
there is still the call is still going to get answered for some of these places. It's just going to be by somebody else. And so once those agencies can get over the fact that it's not just their patch or their colored fire truck, whatever it is, black, red, green, blue, orange, that it's not their, hose and ladder, hook and ladder company, whatever stuff that's going to it. It's this bigger picture. Some agencies need to shut their doors, and that's part of the solution here is at least some agencies need to shut their doors so that something bigger and better can happen, so that an
Gotcha.
economy of scale can exist. Sometimes that leads to career staffing, sometimes it doesn't always have to, but regardless, the redundancy and
Okay.
the unnecessary and the fighting just
So
needs to go
so
away.
so Tim, we have 2 instances here, or 2 examples. We have a situation where we have a loss of volunteers, right? People who are not entering the service, are not entering the
Mm,
profession, so to speak, on a volunteer basis. And then you also have maybe a need for consolidation of excessive number of departments, right? Are
mhm.
there What else is leading to a crisis or collapse in our fire EMS service throughout the country?
Yeah, yeah, and on the point of volunteerism too, undoubtedly, generational, whatever you want to call it, stuff, Gen Z, Y, Millennium,
Right,
whatever
right.
deals. Yeah, no one's going to volunteer for this crap anymore because they don't have time.
Yeah,
We've got full-time jobs, we've got to do stuff, we have families, we have commitments, soccer practice, whatever, and so we can't just volunteer anymore. We need to get paid for it, for what's going on, or we just don't even commit at all and don't even sign up. So that certainly is real, and it's not going away. It's not going to get better. One of the biggest things, especially on the EMS side of the house, that is really crippling it is the funding aspect of things. So EMS, which at the national level is overseen by the Department of Transportation. At state levels, most EMS agencies at the state level are overseen by like the Department of Health, and then it breaks down even from there. So with funding mechanisms, though, the fire service is a bit older than the EMS industry. EMS has been around since what, the 60s, the white paper, whatever existed then, gaining prominence in the 70s and then 80s, starting to actually formalize and look like something in the 90s, and then becoming more structured, organized, even career developing into the 2000s. So the issue, though, is that the funding behind EMS is very much reactionary and it's half-assed. So most EMS agencies are funded by billing patients, and primary payers consist of Medicaid, Medicare, private insurance, or out-of-pocket pay. Medicaid, Medicare, depending on where you live, the percentage that's covered as far as the population, ranges anywhere from 50, 60% to 70, 80%. Florida, for example, snowbird kind of thing. So you could expect 70% Medicaid, Medicare population there versus ski town in Colorado, where Medicaid, Medicare population might even be 40% combined for the two of them. The issue here is that when ambulance services bill, just because they bill something doesn't mean they're going to get paid that. So you go to a doctor, for example,
Right.
see your doctor, your PA, nurse practitioner, whatever, and you get a bill and it's for $1,000. Okay, well, insurance is going to pay this amount of money. You owe your deductible, your out of pocket, whatever stuff, and then you're on the hook for the rest of it. In the EMS side of the house, when it comes to Medicaid and Medicare, you can bill $1,000, let's say. Medicare on most patients is going to pay roughly about $242 for that patient.
Okay.
Upwards of maybe 400 depending on the type of call and what was all done. But either way, they're certainly not paying $1,000, even though it's what you're billing. Then you're stuck with this $700 gap or more, and you can't do anything about it. You can't bill on top of that. You can't try to balance your sheet and balance bill these patients. It's against the law. So you're stuck with just that crappy amount. So $200 for this call doesn't pay for anything. We get reimbursed, and I use air quotes for that. We get reimbursed for our work, but that reimbursement is by no means compensation, and that's what we should be.
When you say compensation, you mean it's not recovering the entire cost of that
No,
run, right? The actual run
yeah,
is not the cost of that run is far more than $242 or whatever the case may
absolutely,
be, right?
yeah,
So how does that cost get made up then?
yeah. So then, any gap that's there, and it depends on the agency now, public, oriented ones where city managers, village administrators, or whatever would be involved, then now it relies on the tax base. So you've got to somehow, it's part of your budget. So you've got to build that in. If you're contracting with a nonprofit agency, for example, you might be paying a contract fee to them, or many of them still may not have a contract fee with your municipality, particularly like a township or village, just on the smaller level. So they get by either donations or pancake breakfasts and bake sales and other stupid crap to try to nickel and dime their way up to cover their
Right.
costs. Now, with them being primarily volunteer, and I say volunteer when they may not actually be volunteer by IRS definition, but when they're volunteer in nature, luckily that overhead amount is not super high typically.
Right.
But again, people aren't going to these agencies anymore. They're just they're you can try to create more EMTs and paramedics, but it doesn't matter because the EMTs and paramedics, for the most part, that get created want to get paid and have a job,
Right.
and they're not going to go to the volunteer small little places. So the small places on their own, more and more, just can't exist. And if you try to maintain them on your own, the need for tax funding really just has to be there. Whether it's from the municipal standpoint, or we're seeing growth in popularity with special taxing districts. So ambulance authorities or fire protection districts, and that at least changes the game a little bit. Tax-based funding really is kind of where things need to be. It's a service that if you want it, that you have to pay for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the
So
hard well the hardest thing about the industry is that with a low call volume, that means that you're not going to be responding a whole lot. So we have to accept the fact that we have to pay for readiness and pay for people to be willing and there to respond. So you're still going to get billed, and that's to supplement the tax part. But that's really the trend of where it's got to go is it's got to be tax funded at the local level. It's a local problem.
It's an interesting thing, and I don't want to get this conversation derailed off topic per se, but you talked about low call volume, right? And so, I was working in a small bedroom community, my first city administrator gig outside of Wichita, and we actually were split into two counties. South side of our city was actually in Sedgwick County, which is where Wichita's at. I met one day with the EMS director of Sedgwick County, and he went through and gave me a sort of a dissertation a little bit on EMS and talked about, well, there's even call atrophy or atrophy. If you have a EMS staff who's not getting the call volume, then they're not really getting exposure to the repetition, the rep, so to speak, and that their skills can decay. And so he was explaining to me that even in the county, Sedgwick County, we got I don't know how many people are in Sedgwick County, maybe 600,000 or more. I'm not sure. You'd have a rotation of the EMS staff from even the higher call volume stations around the county into the lower and back and forth, so that they would get that rotation in the skill set. And I think that's another challenge that you face when you're in a small community, is if you're trying to chat. First of all, it's hard to attract talent because you can't pay the same hourly wages that they can get in a larger community. But then if you're trying to also attract the younger talent, they can't get the call volumes that they want in order to really sharpen their skill sets fresh out of the academy, or what have you. Is that a fair explanation of it all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then you throw on top of that, fire-based ambulance service systems, particularly those that require all their people to be paramedics.
Right.
So every person on the fire engine, three or four people, plus on the ambulance, skill degradation is a real thing of trying to get intubations in and IV access, even just medications. There's litigation now. Two paramedics are found guilty on manslaughter. So like there's bad stuff that's happening in the industry. Um,
So Tim, we've talked about, sort of, we've identified that there's a problem, right? And
mhm,
as far as this crisis that's coming, that you're putting forth, and we didn't really get into a time frame of when that's coming, but you think
mhm.
that's literally on the horizon. Like within the next
Yeah,
couple of years, you're going to see significant movement on that front, right? Almost it's going to crystallize across the country, the national landscape, and you're going to see almost a national awakening to this crisis, right?
yeah.
And you assign that to a decrease in volunteerism. We talked about the need to consolidate all these different agencies, and also issues with the funding sources. Are there any other aspects that are leading to this crisis, or contributors to this crisis, that we need to talk about and unpack for the sake of this discussion?
The funding part is a big thing, and I had some predictions kind of going into the past couple of years, and some of them are starting to happen, which is unfortunate and kind of Cassandra-ish freaky. I think that 2030 is going to be the big year where things are just going to massively collapse, and I'm not talking small scale. I'm talking massively. It's not going to exist. But the framework of that is starting with a couple of big things that are happening within the industry right now. One of the things that's surrounding the industry, trying to address the reimbursement, the pay structure stuff, because many commercial insurance companies thrive off of whatever CMS or Medicare, Medicaid set for the pay rate. So some of them stick steadfast to that. Others, deviate a little bit and pay more. So one of the major things going on within the industry right now is that ambulance services throughout the country have to report all of their costs associated to doing business to Center for Medicare, and they're analyzing that. And the hope is that they will realize that, holy crap, we are
240 some
significantly,
dollars is not enough, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
it's not
yeah.
enough. We actually should be paying them, 700, 800, 900, or $1,000 per call. That's the hope. I think we're all optimistic that that was going to be happening. I'm losing my optimism in that actually happening. And one of the big things of why I'm losing that optimism is that 2019 is when this started. So 2019 is when CMS rolled out this Medicare cost reporting with the intent of analyzing how much does it cost to do this, service. And that's every agency from, you run 10, ambulance calls a year to you run 100,000 or a million ambulance calls a year. So itty bitty middle of nowhere all the way through New York City. The whole spectrum is being analyzed. So that was the start of 2019. Also in 2019, a pilot project came through called ET3, which is the Emergency Treatment, Triage, and Transport, or Triage, Treatment, and Transport, I should say, in that order, or ET3. And so that project was designed to look at ambulance. The solution right now is you only get paid if you transport a patient to the hospital. not all patients need to go to the hospital.
That's correct.
ED overcrowding, that kind of stuff happens. So how can EMS providers provide a service, provide medical care, not just transport, because Medicare sees us as transporters. We're not classified as medical providers. We're classified as transporters.
That's
We're
one of
the
the most
taxi.
that's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard.
Yeah.
I mean,
And so we are not
so
considered.
I'm sorry, Tim. So you
Yeah.
guys just load up a patient in the back and just said, "Hey, hold on, we're gonna get you to the hospital," and that's it. There's
Yep.
no
And
cares provided.
and mind you, as a paramedic, I have roughly 2,000 hours of training. I can do literally everything that can be done in the first 10 minutes of an emergency room. Everything, the exact same stuff. Aside from cracking open a patient's chest and physically pumping on their heart, can do all the exact same stuff in the first 10 minutes of an emergency department. But I'm not considered a medical provider in CMS's eyes. I'm a transporter. I'm a point A to point B person. So this ET3 initiative, a selected amount of agencies throughout the country applied for it, and the intent was analyze, okay, what can be done to intercept this on the front end, and can patients go other places? Can they go to clinics, or can treatment be adequately provided at home, therefore not going to the hospital,
Or at the
saving,
scene, right?
yeah,
At the scene. I mean, it's
yep,
just yeah, yeah.
and saving thousands of dollars in unnecessary emergency department bills and readmissions and whatever. So there was hope with that, and then what happens? COVID happens, and that's like the playground of opportunity for treat at home. And so they opened up and became very flexible with their guidelines, allowed for some extra billing to happen. Well, just a few months ago, they shut the program down, canceled it, and it's dead in its tracks, no longer being analyzed, no longer being looked at. And so I see that as a significant problem, probably to the point where and again, I've lost my optimism in CMS increasing our rates as a result, because they're not seeing the benefit really of us in the clinical space. So that's a significant problem. So I think
So
that,
if I'm understanding this correctly, right, and I'm not trying to get
mm,
tinfoil hat conspiracy theory or anything like that, but in a strange way, aren't these small departments incentivized to basically take patients to the hospital no matter
yeah,
what?
yeah, basically, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the only way they get paid. Yeah, and there's a couple of billing opportunities out there, but many of them aren't even taking advantage of that. So yeah, for the most part, you're only getting paid if you transport. So you're not making money. What I think is going to be happening is that roughly in 2025, 2026, when CMS is done with this analysis of agencies, and they come out actually with their findings, recommendations, I don't think we're going to have a spiked increase in reimbursement like we're hoping for. It's going to stay, we'll get, instead of a 4% or 6% increase, we'll get a 15-20% increase, and they'll call it a day. So
Like a one-time Band-Aid, right? But it's not
yeah,
gonna solve the problem. Yeah.
yep. And so that will just be the icing on the cake of crippling the industry. And what we had hoped for will just be killed. It'll be dead. And so the only viable solution then going forward is going to be tax base. It's going to be direct funding from tax source.
Well,
So
this you might be getting a little ahead of me. So is this basically the answer then? Is that the only way to
mhm,
solve this crisis is that there has to be a complete reevaluation and a paradigm shift in how these agencies are funded? Is that literally the only solution that you see on the
I
horizon?
unfortunately, yeah, and I think it's to the point where, while we're relying on Medicare, Medicaid, insurance funding now, I think it's almost to the point where we have to prepare to fund ambulance services as if there is no other source, as if there's no other source of income for billing, period. Because I think it's just going to cripple. And I hope it doesn't. I hope I'm wrong, but I have this fear that it's going to cripple. And so, like, fire departments right now, fire departments, don't make money. They're a cost. Police departments don't make money. They're a cost, minus tickets and fines, whatever. Fire departments, the amount of fines or fees that are associated there pay maybe for a month's of electricity bill. So basically, they're a complete payout,
Right.
non-money generator from municipal standpoint. And I think ambulance services are going to become that, where they're just going to have to be paid for. Part of this whole thing that's messing things up right now too is that in most states, police services are required by law. You have to have some sort of police coverage, whether it's sheriff, city police, whatever, your own township, you've got to have some sort of police coverage. You also have some sort of fire coverage. And there can be pockets in the country here and there, but for the most part, this exists in every state where you've got to have some sort of fire coverage. Now, it can be a volunteer department that has no schedule and has 3 people on the roster, but on paper that exists as fire coverage.
Right.
As far as EMS goes, and this term essential service, which gets thrown around, that essential service designation only exists in about a dozen and a little bit more states in the country. Now, really, that term is an unfunded mandate because, again, you could have a volunteer department that has 2 people on the roster and unscheduled, and to say that yes, you have ambulance coverage doesn't, that's all that's required in most states by law. But the reality is that you don't have a service on paper. You do, but you don't in some of these places. And so I think that the only way that our industry, my industry, is going to survive is that it needs tax funding. It sucks. It adds more burden, but I think that we have to prepare ourselves to be 100% tax funded, even potentially without any reimbursements in the future. That we're a few years away from that one, but we've got to be tax funded because
So
it's not going to survive.
okay, so let's assume that your theory or your thesis is correct, and that's the only way is through a tax funding, right?
Mm.
Are there any particular structures or types of funding, or whether it's special districts or a special sales tax or something dedicated? Are you referring to maybe a dedicated tax for that
hmm
specific purpose, or just generally out of the general fund? What's your thought process as far as the most fruitful or beneficial way of setting this up for EMS and fire as we move into the future? Because
Yeah,
right now, because the reason why I ask is because, to my knowledge, I would venture to guess, maybe I'm completely misguided here, but 90+%, if not 99% of all police departments are funded by the general fund. There isn't like a
hmm
special tax per se for the police department, right?
probably not. No,
Right.
there's aside from cell phone coverage, whatever percentage tax and blah blah. Yeah, it's general fund. Same thing with most fire departments. It's going to be general fund.
Correct.
EMS in many respects isn't even on that payroll unless you have an existing contracting fee uh, for services provided. Tying a lot of this together, there are too many ambulance services. There are too many fire departments. There's probably even too many police departments for that matter, but that's not my expertise. I'm not going there. So there's too many departments. We still need coverage across the board. So we need consolidation of sort or merging, whatever it is, shared services, whatever you want to call it. There needs to be coming together, building an economy of scale, and building a structure so that, yes, in the middle of this rural environment where you will never ever on your own become a career department, you will never ever on your own have full time staffing. You can't afford it. You can't find the people to come work for you. You will be a revolving door. It will never ever work. We need to find a way to make it somehow work where they can at least have some sort of equitable care, understanding that you live in a rural environment and it's going to take a little bit longer for someone to get here, but you're paying for someone to be here. The only way that's going to exist and the only way that we can build an economy of scale is if there's some sort of regionalization, consolidation, merging, shared service, whatever. And where it seems to work best from the funding standpoint is you got a couple of options. We look at sustainability throughout the industry. And sustainability isn't just recruitment and retention problems. It's not just funding problems. It comes down to two things, I think, that are the root causes, which is the way that places are organized and the way that they deploy or the way or how they respond. So from the organizational standpoint, which directly impacts the city managers, the town, administrators, village administrators, county administrators, whoever, the organizational standpoint, you have a couple of options. Either the big guy has the service, owns the service, and then everyone contracts with them. That can work, and that's done. It's common. Oftentimes, the hardship with that is that the small guys then feel as though their voice is not heard. The big guy just gets his way all the time. We're stuck with how they do it. I've even had some fire chiefs say that you're getting what you pay for, and that's all you're getting. Deal
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my former department, the chief said that with some municipalities when they merged in. He said, you're getting what you pay for, and that's it. And that's a bad attitude, but it exists and it happens. And I'm sure, this happens with public works, with other shared services too. In some environments, though, it works just fine. And if it's working, great. Where the most feasible, cohesive environment seems to be existing in my side of the realm is in the special taxing districts, where you separate things from municipal government, and you become your own, where you become your own ambulance taxing district or ambulance service district or ambulance authority or fire protection district, whatever the terminology is, in your locale, where you no longer have the elected, town supervisors or village electeds, whoever. You no longer have the same body of elected people trying to fight and get their way, or city administrators for that matter. You create your own board. You're on the tax roll just like the schools are on the tax roll, just like water utility and whatever else is on the tax roll, and you exist as your own entity. And what that affords agencies to do is to exist across multiple borders without any favoritism. Now, you have to be smart, and you have to still build an agency around the call volume, which is typically in the bigger, the populated
Right.
areas. But at least the representation can be spread equally, either amongst, equal on the tax base. A property of this amount of money, of this value, generates this tax across the board, or through a funding formula that municipalities share, that accounts for their population, accounts for their call volume, and accounts for some sort of equal pay share, something in that respect. But either way, you're not owned by one municipality. And again, that structure can work, but there still seems to be fighting when that happens.
Right.
And so, what I've seen, at least in some areas, is that it's been existing that way in the form of nonprofits. So, three municipalities got together, and their board makes up, the board of this, volunteer ambulance service or volunteer fire department. So, some of that does already exist, but there isn't defined tax base going to it. There's just, contracted fees of some sort, and the contracted fee typically is minimalistic. It keeps the lights on. It's barely enough to get by. Those agencies aren't going to survive. They need to get bigger. And rather than being gobbled up in a hostile takeover, more palatably, they should just merge into, or consolidate, I would rather say consolidate into one bigger agency that's, at least they can have their equal say.
Okay.
And so I think that's the growing trend in my industry that seems to be the most palatable.
So Tim, we talked about this whole funding mechanism and basically how to basically, I guess, get ahead of the problem that you see on the horizon. Okay.
Mhm.
And we got a lot of city managers and folks who are listening to this podcast, and they're probably not super excited about running out and talking to their mayor or the council and say, you know what? I figured out the solution to the problem. We need to create a new taxing district, right? I
Mhm.
mean, so one, there has to be some sort of laying the groundwork or foundation for that long term and start having those kind of conversations, right? And
Yeah.
maybe you want to speak to that or not, but I'm going to throw out a second point as well. So what can and maybe I'm teeing up your consulting services and so forth and so on. What can a city manager or a department head who's overseeing fire, EMS, so forth and so on, what can they do now? Say, hey, we know there's a problem on the horizon. We see it coming and
Mhm.
we see a solution on the horizon, like this is the long-term solution, but what can they do now? What manageable steps can a department or a community take now to start getting out in front and fixing this problem and getting ahead of it? Are there any solutions on that, on
Y-
the more immediate solutions?
Yeah, yeah, and going back to the point I mentioned about, sustainability within my industry comes down to, I think, two root items, which is, again, the organizational model and the deployment model, the operational model. Essentially, you take a small municipal area, large land area with a combined population base of 9,000 people. Their problems are going to be vastly different than a municipality, a city with a population of 100,000 people, or something bigger with 200, 300,000, whatever. Totally different problems there. So if the agency is complaining that they are struggling, they don't see positivity on the horizon, they can't keep people in, they need more, they, recruitment and retention are problems. So if they're complaining about stuff already, The two questions that need to be asked of them is, okay, and this isn't has nothing to do with do more with less, but how are you going to do things differently? How, or at least how are you going to do more differently? And there are ways to do that. So what are you going to change about your operational model that allows efficiency to exist, or at least allows for all the bases to be covered? And if you can't operationally change anything, if that doesn't do anything, then you need to look at how you are organized. So if you're a city of 100,000 people already, you've got some struggles here and there. Likely you can change some organizational or some operational things and get ahead of this. If that doesn't work, then you need to start looking at, okay, now as an organization, do we need to do things differently? Should we no longer be a city department? Should we be a county department? Should we be a taxing district? So that's kind of the progression I would take.
Okay.
And they may not have to cross that boat,
So
or that line.
so when
Uh,
you get to the operational side, I mean, I know
mhm.
every situation is going to have its own unique factors and whatnot, but can you do some quick hits on
Yeah,
things that you see that are common in your consulting as far as what a department or a community can do to create some operational efficiencies or effectiveness or benefits? Like, what are some of the major things that you see in your profession or in your consulting?
yeah. So one of the hardest pills to swallow for fire departments is that 80% of their call volume or more in many places is EMS oriented, and the amount of actual structure fires, hose line is pulled and charged, and water is sprayed. That's 2%, 5% of calls, at best. What existed 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, even 25 years ago, is vastly different than it is now. And so, the fire side of the thing, the equation is absolutely they need to be there. They need to exist. The coverage needs to be available, and the resources need to be available so that when a call happens, that they're there. So it's not necessarily about it's not about cutting people, but it's using them a bit differently or deploying them differently. If you're staffing with a four-person fire engine, okay, do you need to? Can it be done differently? Or if that four-person fire engine is going
Let I
to,
got I gotta stop you right there, Tim. I gotta
yeah,
stop you because I hear this all the time as a city administrator or what. 4 guys on a truck, 2 in, 2 out,
yeah,
yada, right? You gotta have
yep,
4 there, otherwise you're gonna, we know the story, right? Can
yeah.
you can you get by with less than 4 firefighters on a truck?
Um, on a truck, perhaps. On a scene, no.
Okay.
So what I would say then, and in some places, again, it comes down to you need an outside voice to come in and provide some thought and reason for it, and that's where the value in consulting, I think, is. In some situations, that is absolutely what should happen, does need to exist. Yes, but it doesn't necessarily need to be universal across the department. A two-person fire truck in many respects is not efficient or effective at all. Three is probably the bare minimum for most agencies. Now, rural environment, different story. In a bigger city, three, four, okay. With that though, you take a medical call. And in a high acuity medical call, you send a fire engine and an ambulance. Okay, I get it. Manpower, people, whatever. Yes, for the majority of other medical calls, though, the 90% that aren't high acuity or aren't really emergent, do you need to send that fire apparatus with four people in a $500,000 or a $1.6 million fire apparatus going down the road getting 6 to 12 miles per gallon? Wear and tear, shocks, salt, whatever. Is it necessary? Could that apparatus instead be split in two and two people go on a pickup truck and go whatever, so that one of the gripes I always had with the department I worked for was we would send our four-person fire engine on a call, and then one guy would go and drive the ambulance to the hospital. So what happens with that fire truck now? Well, we followed to the hospital, leaving our district completely uncovered, having our neighboring district, then reliant on going there. We didn't go back because we didn't want to short staff the rig with three.
Right.
So instead,
And
we
he's gotta get back to the station somehow, right?
yeah. So instead, it was a 0% or 100% mentality. And I think the part of the fire service that has to start adjusting now is that 0% and 100% no longer works. You've got to find some way to be 50-50 or maybe even 30-70, in some respects. So is the way that you're deploying then part of the issue? What if you instead didn't have four on this fire truck, and you had an engine and a ladder company and whatever? What if you changed up, and I'll use the Q word, what if you used a quint and you staffed it with three, and then you used a pickup truck and you called it a squad or something, and you had two people on there and they did medical calls? So there are ways to do this. Now it's going to piss off people. It really is. And there's we always joke or say that the fire service industry, that there's two things firefighters hate. There's it's change and the way things are.
Right.
And I had someone recently say,
So firefighters are never happy, right?
yeah, and I say this with love and respect. I've been a firefighter, 10 years career myself, 11 years career. Um, but it's not so much change or the way things are that they hate; it's the fear of loss. And so what needs to be
Loss of
under
what, Tim?
loss, period,
Okay.
loss of staffing, loss of pay, loss of this, loss of that, anything loss. There's a
Okay.
fear of loss. And so what I think needs to happen, especially at the administrative level, is that the conversation has got to be had with the firefighters, with the ground people, the boots on the ground, to explain where we're at, what needs to be changing and why, and how. Involve them in the process. Don't just inform them and tell them what's going to happen. They need to come to this conclusion themselves that, look, yeah, the volumes are different. We can still provide two in, two out. We just have to provide it differently than we did it before.
Gotcha.
Now, we don't need to lose people. Losing people is not the answer. Taking away from the organization and the numbers and cutting staffing is not the answer. I don't condone that in the least. You still need 20 firefighters, 21 firefighters, on a fire ground to efficiently do operations on a single family, residential structure, undoubtedly. But they can get there differently. And I totally get.
But here's the thing. You say that, Tim, right? Because
Mhm.
what was that number again? Repeat that. I heard that a while back, and I want you to repeat that because that number shocked me when I heard it from. Well, I'll give you some context.
Mhm.
Obviously, I was working in a small city. We had a volunteer fire department,
Yeah.
and we relied on supplemental aid
Mhm.
essentially from a neighboring larger jurisdiction. And one of the things that we had a conversation about was the minimum manpower required to fight just a regular residential house fire, right?
Mhm.
And you said that number was what?
Roughly about 2021. I'm thinking the NFPA standard would be 1910 for urban, 1920 for more rural oriented. But yeah, typically it's about 19, 20, 21 people
And in my
total.
community, we basically had 25 slots for volunteer firefighters. We couldn't even
Mhm.
get those 25 slots filled. And good luck trying to get anywhere close to 20 people on a site for a residential fire. Any
Yeah,
call.
yeah.
I
Five
mean,
five people did 80% of the work there.
it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's absolutely crazy. But one of the things I wanted to touch on here, and I know you are okay with hot takes and having an opinion, so I want to throw this out there, and I
Mhm.
might get shot or something by some disgruntled folks listening to this podcast. I gotta tell you, man, do we need to start looking? Okay, I'll just get those out there without any pretext. Do we need to have 24-hour shifts for firefighters as opposed to 10-hour shifts or 12-hour shifts? I mean, what's the
Yeah,
story behind that?
yeah,
Is that really beneficial?
yeah. Yes and no. So yes, there's an efficiency component to it where you take staffing, for example. So 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week. There's a couple of ways of doing this. One of the ways, the most common way, is a 24. So, and I'm talking in the career environment here. In the career environment, 24-hour shift is very, very common. Now, sometimes they do like combinations of 48-hour shifts, but either way, 24 on, and there's different versions of this. One of them is
Right.
called the Chicago 24 on, 48 off. I worked at California, which was 24 on, 24 off, 24 on, 24 off, 24 on, 48 off, or 4 days off. So work, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Then you got Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday off, and then you repeat the cycle. At any rate, with those models, and when you work a three platoon model, so you have three different shifts, we would call it, working 24-hour shifts, what that equates to is efficiency as far as the amount of people, the amount of FTEs that you need, compared to if you work a standard 40-hour work week, which mathematically won't work out. So the best closest option is 42 hours a week. With that model, it requires at the very least 4 platoons. So now you take something where, okay, let's say you have that 4-person fire engine, and that's what you staff your department as is 4 people, and you have one fire station. So every day there's 4 people working. 4 people times 3 shifts is 12, as opposed to 4 people times 4 shifts is now 16. So you've got a 30% increase in FTEs that are needed. Now the flip side of that is that the 3 platoon system, they're working an average of 56 hours per week. FLSA requirements, or at least regulations for firefighters, allow them to work up to 53 hours without overtime, therefore only 3 hours of overtime, blah, blah. On the other side of the equation, they work 42 hours a week, so different requirements there. So arguably, the firefighter who is working 40 hours a week might make $50,000 for a salary. The person who's working 56 hours a week is working more hours, obviously. Some of them can be sleeping. And so, it's fair then that they make more than $50,000, that they make 65, whatever that would be, an equivalent side. So, from the personnel standpoint, just trying to find that many people, yeah, 24 hours is needed. And heck, I would even say, especially for like when I lived in Colorado, it was hard enough to get by living in Colorado Springs, and affording the Denver market, whatever, for competition. I can't even imagine how much, it costs to live in Breckenridge and Keystone and, stuff in the mountains. People like firefighters and paramedics can't afford to live there. So they've got to drive 2.5 hours to get there.
Right.
So it's very common, especially in Western states, to work in, California. The same there too. We're blue collar people. We can't afford to live there. So it's very common to work 48 hours. And at least that way you're going there for 2 days straight, then you got 4 days off. It's more palatable.
Gotcha.
So the 24-hour shift in rural environments too, yes, I think it is still essential and needed. The flip side is that when it comes down to safety, there gets to be a tipping point where 24 hours just is not safe. Now, for the most part, most agencies, most departments, I would bet have a 2-to-1 ratio of calls where most of their calls, 60% of their calls, 66% of their calls happen during the daytime hours, let's say 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 33% of their calls happen between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. So, all right, do you try to flex your staffing to account for less? You can play that game, but I wouldn't. It's not worth it for the most part. As long as you can still maintain that ratio where the likelihood of someone sleeping at night is still high, then 24-hour shift is still fair. Now, if your ambulance crew, for example, if there's no hospital in your community, and so they have to drive 40 minutes to get to the nearest hospital, well, that means they're probably driving 15 minutes to get to the call, spending some time on scene, doing whatever. Already, then you got 35, 40 minutes have gone by. Now they've got to go drive 45 minutes to the hospital, dilly dally, whatever, 15, 20 minutes, maybe a 30-minute whatever turnover, and then drive back for that time. So now that 2 o'clock call turns into you're not getting back to the station until 4:30. Like you're a bag of shit after a while.
Yeah.
2 calls after midnight. I've been there. 2 calls after midnight, and you're kind of useless after a while. So if the crews are awake more at night, if they're not able to get, I think 6 hours is kind of the golden ask of straight sleep. But if they're not able to get at least one 4 hour stretch of sleep at night, it's not safe anymore. It really isn't, especially with longer transport or commute times. So then departments and communities, if we're going to say that we're putting our morals on safety and we're a safe department and blah blah blah, if you're actually going to stand up for that, then you owe it to everyone at that point to question whether 24-hour shifts are safe. And if they're not, then you probably should switch to 12-hour shifts. So
So you
that's just the way it goes.
so the notion though that's out there that some people believe or adhere to, that getting rid of 24-hour shifts would actually save taxpayers money, you don't buy
No,
into that. That's not a fair assessment at all.
no, I wouldn't say so. And even when I've looked at it for other departments analyzing that, because we do that with my consultancy, looking at not only the pay but the workload and the amount of people. Typically, the 24-hour shift structure with that three platoon model is the most efficient way to go. 24-hour shifts with four platoons, that happens too. But again, that just comes down to more FTEs. And even though you might save on the salary side, well, you're still getting, you know, paying for benefits and fringe and all the other stuff to go with it, plus the amount of equipment, the 2,500 bucks for turnout gear and this equipment, that equipment, all that stuff adds up. So the cost then typically is higher per person when it comes down to it, when you're looking at those multiple shifts. Yeah, 24-hour shift, three platoon is the most efficient model in most 90 something percent situations.
Okay, well, just for the record, I think I had a police officer slip me a 20 to ask that
Yeah.
question because all my police officer buddies don't like the fact that firefighters get paid while they're sleeping. So that's for all the police officers out there. I guess tough luck, guys.
Yeah.
You're not
Well,
going to
and
get any
and
break from Tim on that one.
no, and there is an option to pay less during sleep hours. FLSA allows that, but then when they have to wake up and actually perform and work, then you have to pay them overtime or more. So trying to play that game and just do the math of it. Whoever is the accountant or the finance person and does payroll, that would just be a god awful nightmare. And it's so much cleaner just to flat out pay them an hour per hour across the board. So I
Gotcha.
wouldn't even play that game. And
Gotcha.
for people that it's a dissuasion tool. If I had a choice between a place that just paid me flat versus a place that you know paid me less to sleep, but when I woke up I got overtime, whatever, I wouldn't go there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, we're over the hour mark here, so I want to hit a couple of quick hits on this. So, was there
Yeah.
any other points you wanted to hit on the operational efficiencies? We talked about basically how the we deliver our service, right,
Mhm.
and different structures. Is there anything else on that front you might want to touch on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that some of those parts, they are going to play a difference between the types of departments. So what might universally be a solution over here may not be over there. So that's the part, and that's where I do highly recommend not just to bring business my side, but you got to bring in a consultant, a fire and EMS consultant specifically to handle that. Someone who has worked the job, knows the job, because no offense to other generalist consultants out there or workforce specialists, whatever. If and unless that person has been in the industry, the fire chief, the department, the EMS agency, the people aren't going to give two shits about them. So,
You
and
mean they're not going to
they're
buy in, right? You mean they're not
yeah,
going to buy into the recommendation
and
or
they're
whatnot?
just not,
Yeah.
that person, that consultant just is not going to understand the type of people that they're dealing with, the mentality, the work, everything. They're not going to understand it. So you've got to have a fire and EMS specific consultant, someone who has been in the industry, walked in the shoes, to be there and provide this. Without that, they're just not going to have the respect, and you're probably not going to get your money's worth out of them. And that's rightfully so. I have zero experience in the police, law enforcement world, so I am not the right person for that type of consulting.
Right.
But fire and EMS, absolutely. They're not all the same. So the solutions that are out there, yeah, they are a bit different, and it really takes understanding the data behind the organization, but not only the data, but the context. There's history that's there, there's traditions that's there. Some of that has to be abandoned, but then some of it also has to be expanded upon and maintained. And knowing the difference between the two is the key. And that's where again that fire or EMS specific consultant is there. In many respects, a lot of the fire chiefs, EMS chiefs, or directors, have a lot of the solutions or a lot of great ideas. Sometimes, no offense to the city managers, they just need the damn city manager to listen to them.
Right.
So part
No,
of
fair
my
enough.
yeah, I mean, part of
Well, actually, that kind of I guess dovetails into the last set of questions I was going to ask you,
mm,
Tim, and that is, we got city managers listening and we got
mm,
elected officials listening. I guess that maybe is your my takeaway for the city managers. What advice would you give to city managers listening to this podcast? One, I guess on a individual micro level, right? Community specific, department specific,
Hmm.
what recommendations would you give those city managers to listen to as far as moving forward? And on the macro, larger picture, as far as the crisis, impending crisis, collapse of EMS, what advice would you give to city managers listening to this podcast?
Yeah, the biggest things I would say is that this absolutely is a local problem, and you being local officials in some respect, this is your problem, and it's not going to get fixed unless you're involved with it. Even if you're already, you're only contracting with the nonprofit, whatever, fire department, volunteer, EMS agency, whatever. If you're not stepping in to provide some sort of funding for that service, more than likely they're not going to be able to succeed, certainly not thrive on their own. It's just the likelihood of that happening. Some places, very, very few and far between, are getting by, but most are not. So you're going to be involved in some form or way. And that same respect, you're contracting for a service, so you are absolutely owed what you're getting, what you're paying for. If you are expected to have a functioning volunteer fire department where people, respond, then ask. You are well in your right to get the numbers. Ask for the data on what does this look like? What is your turnout time? How many people show up? Get the information. How many of them are actually compliant and don't have facial hair for volunteer firefighters, especially? So how many people can actually structurally firefight and are qualified for this? So get the information that you need. You deserve to have that, and your citizens deserve to know it. And I think that's the biggest point right now is many areas, especially rural, are at this crisis collapsing point where transparency is needed. And many citizens, I don't feel, understand or know or have even heard that there is this issue, and they need to hear it. If this is the first time on this podcast that you're hearing that EMS agencies and fire departments are having troubles, your fire chief, your EMS director, your EMS chief, whoever, has failed you, because this should have been talked about years ago. You should have been hearing about this for years. I should only be reinforcing some of the things they're talking about and maybe giving a couple of crazy ideas. But this should not be the first time you're hearing of this.
And I guess an extension of that, Tim, if I was going to extend the question or that question to you as far as your advice to the governing body that's might
Mhm.
be elected officials might be listening to this podcast, I guess you would say probably, if I'm reading you correctly, that the elected officials need to start doing a better job of communicating this issue to the electorate and start sort of prepping them for this eventual outcome, correct?
Yeah, and I mentioned this to another group too, that municipalities and agencies, you have the right to fail. You have the right, especially if it's not required. Like EMS technically in most states is not even required. Ambulance service is not required. So you are well within your right, actually, to not even have an ambulance service respond to your agency, to your community. People call 911 and no one will show up. The dispatcher will say, "Oh, there's no ambulance service assigned to your community. No one is showing up. You have to get in the car and do it yourself." You have that right. Now, I don't recommend that. I think
Yes,
that's a
yes.
horrible. Yeah, I think that would be an absolutely horrible thing. But in the states where it's not essential, you have that right. So you have the right to failure. You also have the opportunity and the ability ahead of you to succeed. And I think that the citizens in your community need to understand what exists and have realistic expectations for when they call for help, what is actually going to happen. Who is going to show up, how many people are going to show up, where are they coming from, my community, your community, just what is realistically going to happen. And if we provide this much more money, if we can do $7 more on my tax bill for $100,000 residents, what does that equate to? Or if we cut $3 per $100,000 assessed value on my house, what does that equate to? So like that, those are the realistic things that need to be talked about, because in many of these situations, that's all we're talking about. Or even, the difference between a career department and a non-career department might just be $15 per 100,000 or $25 per $100,000 assessed value.
Well,
So if I as a taxpayer, can pay $125 or whatever more on my tax bill per year, and I'm going to have this type of service, then all right, let me make that decision.
Well, I think generally speaking is that most people are okay with paying taxes so long as they get a
Hmm.
value for those taxes, right? I think the issue becomes a lot of folks think they're paying taxes and not getting value for it. And so I
Yeah,
guess if you are making the pitch that you're going to get X level of service for this amount of tax money that we're going to, tax you, then I think there's going to be it's going to be okay, right? If there's some transparency there. And I
yeah.
guess to tee this up for you as we wrap up this episode, Tim, and thank you for being on, it probably would behoove these jurisdictions out there who are looking at this and trying to be ahead of the curve, who might be saying, hey, we need to put a special taxing district or something out there for the voters to weigh in on. They might want to look into tapping into your services to do maybe sort of a full-on assessment of the department and the cost model, so forth and so on, so they can get a more comprehensive idea of what that cost would entail to provide a certain level of service. Is that a fair representation of some of the services you provide?
Absolutely. And again, for the most part, a lot of fire chiefs, EMS directors, are very capable and have great ideas and can give you a lot of the insight and solution to what's needed. However, their focus is limited. And appropriately so. They're focused on their department, their one place, and so they've got to be in a bit of a narrowed mindset in that role. My focus, however, is much more broad, and I'm able to take not only their department, your community, and go specifically there, but also take in everything that I have from my prior experience and my colleagues that we have the data on a large scale and really look at the big picture and try to identify what will specifically work for you. And that's something that I would say, especially that if you're looking to go the consulting route, which I do recommend, if you're looking to go the consulting route, for one, pick me, yay, that's great. But if you don't, make sure that you are getting customized solutions for your community. You don't want cookie cutter crap. You don't want stuff that is copy pasted between report. Look at the reports from the consulting firms and make sure that they don't just have copy and pasted solutions here and there, because that does exist in some places, and I'm sure that's every consulting industry, period. But look for what did they do specifically for this community or specifically for this department that was intended to make an impact, and that needs to be the focus with your community, with your department, is what are you going to specifically do for us, understanding the big picture, but what specifically is going to be done for us to be different. And that's where your focus needs to be as a city manager, especially when it comes to procurement and selecting the right firm to work with you.
Awesome, awesome. Well, hey Tim, we're going to wrap up here. Before we part, can you quickly give the audience your contact information, how they can reach out and find you, whether it's LinkedIn, website, your company name, so forth and so on?
Yeah. So again, thank you very much. This is a great experience. Certainly glad to continue the conversation with anyone, whether it's formal or informal and just candid and off the cuff. So I'm Tim Nowak. Best way to find me is certainly on LinkedIn. So if you look up Tim Nowak, or I think my handle there is like Tim Nowak EMS. So you can find me certainly there. Otherwise, I work for a public consulting group, which is a national firm, but we work throughout the country. I work remotely. I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and work on projects throughout the country, with a great team as well of primarily full-time consultants. So easiest email there at least is TNOWAK, so T Nowak at pcgus.com. And we can certainly share that on LinkedIn as well. But that's a great way to find me. And you just ask questions, whether it's of me or it's your chiefs. Ask questions, have some uncomfortable conversations, because that's really where we're at. Is the only way we're going to fix the problems that are facing us is if we talk about the uncomfortable things. Without doing that, it's nothing's gonna happen.
Awesome, awesome, great stuff, Tim. Tim Nowak, he's our EMS expert Excellent stuff, Tim. Thank you very much for being on the podcast. You are my resident EMS expert. I've been following you for a long time. You have great content on LinkedIn. I would encourage anyone listening to this podcast who has some questions or wants some consulting work done to look you up and give you some consideration. Thank you for being on the show. Until next time, folks, if you enjoy the podcast, please hit the like and follow button, the subscribe button. Please do a rate and review. I would appreciate all the help. Trying to get to 200 podcast ratings and reviews on Apple. So I would greatly appreciate that. And catch the next episode. I am Joe Turner. I am the host of City Manager Unfiltered, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. And until next time, thank you. Bye-bye.